almost day one, I guess, especially when Saul realized that, or thought David was a threat to him and all this sort of thing, realized that he was going to be the next king and so on and so forth. They never did quite get things worked out. The religious leaders, the scribes, the Pharisees, and all those guys, those people I describe sometimes as the religious big shots of Jesus' day, they never quite got their issues worked out with Jesus. But there are some examples. There's some examples in the Bible of people who had some real issues, but they got them worked out. For example, Jacob and Esau, all that tension between them, and because of, I guess you'd say because of Esau's magnanimity, they got that worked out and they got things smoothed out between them. Joseph and his brothers, the famous quote, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." They thought that he was going to really put the hammer down on them because now Dad's dead and you're going to get back at us for what we've done to you. But Joseph was able to work that out. One of the New Testament examples that I find interesting is Paul and John Mark. Remember Acts chapter 15? In Acts chapter 15, there's a disagreement between Paul and Barnabas about John Mark. We want to go on another missionary journey. We want to take John Mark with us. Barnabas does. Paul says, no way. No. He left us, and he's not going with us anymore. Now, we can speculate about why he left. He got homesick. The trip was dangerous, all kinds of things going on. But for whatever reason, John Mark left them, and Paul wasn't very happy with that, and he held the grudge the rest of his life, right? No, 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 11, as Paul is kind of winding down that letter, he makes mention of the fact that I want Mark to come, because he's profitable to me for the ministry. So you can work things out and fix problems on things that really are important. I think you can look at two apostles of Jesus, and see two reactions to how they really disappointed Jesus. Judas and Peter. Judas betrayed him. Peter denied him. One of them never got it worked out. And from what we know about the rest of the Apostle Peter's life, he got it worked out. And then the fourth kind of conversation I think we need to have in any kind of relationship is to try to focus on and strengthen what really is important. I didn't realize until a few moments after it happened, when Donna was in the room with me and my father passed from this life, that's the first time she ever saw anybody pass from this life to the next life. As a preacher, I'd been there before with other people. And I had watched a loved one, a human being, an immortal soul, however you want to describe all of that. I'd watched that last breath before with other people. But after Dad died, and after a few minutes or seconds, I don't remember how much time had taken place, I looked at Donna and I said, "That's the first time you've ever experienced that or seen that, isn't it?" And she said, "Yeah." If you've never been there, it's kind of interesting. Everything is still there. Everything that we can see is still there. And everything that doctors could examine, if they would examine the body, it's still there. But something's missing. And I'm suggesting this morning that in the things that are really important in your life, and really important with the people whom you love, whether it's family, fellow members of the church, or whoever it is, we need those conversations that breathe life back into that relationship, or breathe life into that relationship to keep it going. Sometimes it's tough to determine what's important and what's urgent. You go through your everyday life, and what seems to be really important isn't so important 5 years down the road, maybe 5 minutes down the road. Let me give you an example. It happened yesterday. I was trying to get some of these thoughts together, and I was working on this and trying to figure out how to say what I wanted to say and so on and so forth. And right in the middle of this really important Bible class that I'm going to be teaching, I heard this sweet voice saying, "Jim, I need a clothes hamper in here." Well, was that urgent? Yeah, I guess, because she can't stay on her feet too long. Was it important? Yeah, it sure was right then. I better go ahead and get that clothes hamper and then come back to working on the class. Sometimes it's tough to figure all that out. And sometimes we miss the really important things because we're taking care of the urgent things. And I think most of us, especially in a Bible class setting, would recognize and would argue for the fact that what's really important are those eternal things. I want to talk a little bit about what I'm calling barriers to communication. There are some things that keep us, husbands and wives, parents, children, members of the church, just people in general. There are some things that keep us from really having good communication with one another. And one of those things that some of the material I've read kind of just overlooks this, and I think it doesn't need to be overlooked. Some of it's just like physical or mental or emotional issues. Some people can't hear very well. And some people can't see very well. And some people have some mental deficiencies that make it difficult to communicate with them or for them to communicate with somebody else. And I'm not trying to minimize any of that. I think it needs to be understood that, not everybody can see or hear or communicate as well as somebody else can. I'm getting more and more aware of what it's like to not be able to hear really well. Only somebody who's still at home says, "I have selective deafness," but that's a different story, I guess. We have those things. You probably heard the story. I may have told the joke before about this older couple. They've been married, let's say 60 years. I'm not going to say 50 because I've been married 50 now. Been married 60 years, and the family had a big celebration, and now all the family's gone, and grandma and grandpa are out in the backyard in the swing, and they're just sitting there together. And he finally just reaches over and kind of taps her on the knee, the one that hadn't been operated on, and says, "I'm really proud of you." She says, "Yeah, I'm tired of you too." Well, I think there's a breakdown in communication there, where somebody wasn't hearing exactly what was being said. And I think when we relate to one another, we need to remember that we have some things that we need to work through. There's another obvious one that some books and articles and sources don't talk much about. Can you really communicate with somebody whom you know never or rarely tells the truth? It's hard to communicate with a person like that. Have you ever heard the expression, "Well, that's what she said, that's what he said, that's what they said," and the way you say that is, I'm not sure if I can believe that or not, because I got a long history of not telling the truth. And if I'm guilty of that kind of lifestyle, and I'm guilty of shading the truth or just flat out not telling the truth all the time, you're going to have a hard time communicating with me, and I'm going to have a hard time communicating with you, because you're challenging, you're questioning everything that I say. Dishonesty is a barrier to communication. There's a whole category of things that people who study this kind of stuff call filters. When you and I communicate, it works through filters. From my end, if I'm doing the speaking, it works through a filter before it gets to you. And if you're speaking, it works through a filter before it gets back to me. It could be a lot of things. We're talking to somebody who's of a different religious persuasion than we are. and you use the term pastor, they're thinking one thing and we're thinking another. They're thinking of the preacher, and we're thinking of pastors, elders, shepherds, bishops, overseers, plural, in a single congregation, because that's what the Bible teaches. We say one thing and they hear another. They say one thing and we hear another, because going through different kinds of filters. You folks don't have music in your church, do you? That's a filter that's working its way through something. Yeah, we got music. We sing like the New Testament tells us to do. What we don't have is what's unauthorized in the New Testament. That's instrumental music. We have music, but we have the God ordained and the God authorized music in New Testament worship. Sometimes it could be age. My generation and the millennial generation, or whatever the ones below the millennials happen to be called, ankle biters, I guess. I don't know what they're called. We have different words for different things, and think of different things when you say certain words. I grew up watching the Flintstones, where they had a gay old time. I don't think they were talking back then about what we're talking about now when they use the word gay. And you can think of your own examples of things like that, where people of one generation have trouble communicating with people of another generation because the language and the mental images don't exactly add up. Could be geography. I'm not talking about when I went to India, halfway around the world. I'm talking about when I went from Metropolis, Illinois to Vienna, Illinois to Dexter, Missouri. And there's a difference. I remember going over to Dexter and asking somebody if they wanted a Coke, and they said, no, I'd rather have a root beer. And I'm thinking, yeah, okay, I don't get it. To me, Coke is all-encompassing. In Metropolis, at least around the people I was around, Coke is just synonymous with soft drink. Over there, you got to be specific. I want a root beer. I want an orange crush. I want 7-Up. Or I want a Coke, Coca-Cola. It really gets confusing if what they want is a Pepsi. That gets really a problem sometimes. All kinds of things can happen because of these filters we work our way through. Here's another barrier. How do you like it when somebody tells you, I know what you're going to say before you say it? How do you like when somebody dusts off the crystal ball and tells you what you're going to say? I don't like that a whole lot. That happens sometimes in relationships. Something will come up, husband, wife, whatever. I know what you're going to say. Don't say it. No, you don't know what I'm going to say. I don't even know what I'm going to say yet, and you don't know what I'm going to say. We had a real good friend. When I typed these notes up, I actually put her name in the notes, and I thought, no, I better take it out because she may see these notes someday. I don't know. She doesn't live anywhere around here right now, but she had a really bad, well, I thought it was a bad habit. I guess she didn't. She had a tradition of finishing your sentence while you were still talking. I don't know if you've ever been around somebody like that or not, but you be halfway through a sentence and she finishes it up for you. I spent, I don't know how much time trying to trick her. As I was talking and she was finishing, I was trying to come up with another ending to what I was trying to say so that I could trick her. I didn't like that, and nobody likes that. When you start telling people what they're going to think and what they're going to say and all that sort of thing. Now, we're going to get into some really good stuff here. The 1960s music. That's one of my favorite categories. Remember a group called the Turtles? Anybody remember them? They had there was always a twist to their songs, kind of a comedy type thing to every song they had. One of the best lines in all of 60s music, in my mind, was from their song Eleanor, where they tell this fictitious girl they're talking to what every woman wants to hear. You're my pride and joy, etc. I love that. I'm sure she felt really good about the etc. part of all that. But they had another song, probably their biggest hit, or one of the biggest hits, was entitled It Ain't Me, Babe. And the song is all about, here's what you're looking for in a man. It ain't me, babe. I'm not what you're looking for. Well, let's take those words and apply it to communication. I'm not the problem here in communication. It ain't me, babe. All I said was, is your mother coming to visit again? And you got all upset about that. That's not my problem. That's your problem. I don't have the problem with communication. You've got the problem with communication. And the very first thing that's going to happen, and we may talk about this before we get through this morning, talk about it again. Anytime, just kind of keep this in mind with communication. And yeah, Donna, I'm listening to myself here. Do not use the word you or your. The very second you do that, if you and I are standing here between class and worship, and we're discussing something that's kind of important to both of us, and it's kind of a source of tension, and I say you, and if I emphasize it by pointing my finger at you, you're on the defensive. Don't use you. If Charles and I back here on the back row and I have a problem, what I need to learn to do is tell him, okay, here's the situation, and here's how it affects me, or here's how I see it. And he's not on the defensive anymore. But as soon as I say, you did this, you did that, you said something, the conversation's over with. By the way, just a little historical note. The Turtles had two lead singers. One of them, the last time I checked, was an associate professor of entertainment studies at Belmont University. That's a nice career path. You started out rock and roll in the 60s, and now you're an associate professor at a university in Nashville, Tennessee. Here's another one. Do you or do you not know? Those of you who are married, and those of you who've got close relationship with somebody, spouse, children, parents, whatever, do you or do you not know what it takes to light their fuse in a bad way? Do you know the words or the expressions or anything you can say that sets them off like a rocket? You're just like your mom. You're just like your dad. You've got too much your maiden name in you. Or if it's the wife saying that, you've got too much Faughn in you. Or you got too much Welch in you, my mother's maiden name. We know what hurts the other person. We know what affects the other person in a negative way. And that's going to break down communication as soon as it happens. Something that you know that will set her off or set him off and light the fuse. As soon as you say that, the conversation's over. Look at John chapter 4. We are going to get into the Bible here, and we're going to get into the Bible a lot in the next set of points that we're going to be talking about. John chapter 4, there's a famous conversation that takes place between Jesus and the woman at the well. We sometimes call her, in my Bible, the heading is Jesus and the woman of Samaria. You know, she's gone out to draw water. She meets Jesus, and he strikes up a conversation with her. And they start talking about living water, so on and so forth. Look at how she refers to Jesus. John chapter 4 and verse 9. She calls him a Jew. Verse 11, she calls him Sir. He said something to her that made her think a little bit more highly of him. Verse 15, she calls him Sir. Verse 19, she calls him a prophet. Now, something happened right before verse 19 that we all are guilty or tempted at least to do when we're communicating with somebody. Go back a couple of verses. Verse 16. Jesus said to her, "Go call your husband and come here." The woman answered him, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You are right in saying, 'I have no husband,' for you've had 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband. What you have said is true." Woman said to him, "Sir," back sir again, but now she's gone up one notch, "I perceive that you are a prophet. Let's talk about religion. Our fathers worshiped in this mountain, and you people say that Jerusalem is the place for worship." She's playing dodgeball, isn't she? Let's change the subject. I don't want to talk about my habits. I want to talk about something else. I don't want to talk about what bothers you about me. I want to talk about who's going to win the election. Let's talk about something. Let's don't talk about that. We need to learn to kind of stay on the subject and make sure that we deal with the subject at hand. She's not the only one to do that. The Gospel of John ends with something similar to that. Jesus and Peter having a conversation. "Do you love me?" You know I love you. And Leo and Adam and others can talk about all the different words for love there, and feed and shepherd and so on and so forth. "Peter, do you love me?" You know I love you. "Peter, do you love me?" "Yeah, you know that I love you." Well, here's what I want you to do. Here's my prediction, my prophecy of what's going to be happening to you from now on. Your job is to feed my sheep, to tend my flock, to shepherd my flock. But here's what's going to happen. And Peter plays dodgeball. There's John. What about him? What do you want him to do? Very loose paraphrase of what Jesus said to Peter is none of you. It's none of your business. If I will that he tarry till I come, what's that to you? You do what I told you to do. I think it was last week we talked about the issue of accepting responsibility. We're going to talk about it again today for my actions. I need to deal with me as I communicate. I need to deal with me in every aspect of my life and my relationship with Jesus and with others. Another barrier that I think we need to deal with, again, reminds me of an old joke. I'm old and I know old jokes. That's the way it goes. But the 2 guys were at work, and one guy was complaining about his wife, and he says, "Man, every time my wife and I get into an argument, she becomes historical." He said, "You mean hysterical?" "No, I mean historical. She brings up everything I've ever done from the past." Bringing up the past is not the way to have effective communication. When the problem is there, as difficult as it may be, you need to deal with the problem at hand then. Define, figure out, decide if it's urgent, if it's important, put it in one of those categories. Maybe it's in both categories at the same time, and try to deal with it. Okay. Here are some principles of good communication. You may want to get your Bible and be ready to start flipping pages, because we're going to be looking at a lot of passages from the Bible that will help me to be a better communicator, help all of us hopefully to be a better communicator. We're going to start in the book of Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 20 and verse 6. Proverbs 20 and verse 6. Many a man proclaims his own steadfast love. King James says goodness. Just put that word goodness in your brain. Many a man proclaims his own goodness, but a faithful man who can find. Go back to Genesis chapter 3. Genesis chapter 3, that original couple and the conversation that takes place after that first sin. And start reading at about verse 8 and go all the way to verse 19, who did God say something to? Who did God hold responsible for what had happened? Did he not say something to the serpent? Did he not say something to Eve? And did he not say something to Adam? So what are you saying, Jim? I need to recognize I could be part of the problem. I could be a big part of the problem. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. One of the problems, one of the principles, I guess, of good communication is that I need to recognize it is me, babe. I may be the problem, or at least I may be a big part of the problem. And so when that very first sin happened, God held each person involved in that responsible for their part in the sin, and they're going to pay for their part in the sin. It's not all just a one-way street. John chapter 5 and verse 6. I think Adam preached a sermon on this not too long ago. One of the weirdest questions that probably has ever been asked. The guy who's sitting at the pool waiting to be put into the pool, he's crippled, he hadn't got anybody to get him in there, and Jesus says, do you want to be made well? Do you want to be made well? That seems like a weird question. Until you start looking at people maybe in your house or in your circle of friends or wherever it happens to be, and they seem to like their misery. They almost seem to revel in the fact that they and their husband don't get along, or their wife doesn't get along, or the kids don't get along, or the in-laws don't get along, or the members of the church don't get along, or whatever. Jerry Barber, that name may be familiar to some of you. He was a located preacher for a long, long time. And now in the last few years, it's been quite a few years now, his ministry, his way of serving is that he goes to churches. Here's somebody that's the preacher's left. Maybe he's been there a long time, and they either decided for him to go or he decided to go or whatever. And so here's this congregation that doesn't have a preacher, and they're looking for a preacher. And Jerry says it's his observation that when a guy has been there quite a while, the next guy that follows usually is not liked very well, because the guy that's been there has been there, whatever, 30 years, 20 years, 25 years, or whatever. And so whoever follows him kind of doesn't have a chance. And Jerry says, I want to be the guy that nobody likes. And so what he does, he's an interim preacher. He'll go to a congregation and say, okay, look, I'll stay with you for a year, 18 months. They'll sign a contract and all that kind of stuff. That at the end of the year, at the end of 18 months, at the end of whatever it is, I'm done. And then you can, during that time, you can be helping you look for a new guy to come and be the permanent guy. When he goes to a congregation, whether it's in that role or just to talk to them about some issues they're having, and here's a congregation where you can feel the tension, you can cut it with a knife when you walk into the building. It's like split right down the middle, maybe. And you can tell that people aren't getting along. You start talking to the elders, and they're talking about all the problems. One of Jerry's first questions is, why do you like it this way? We don't. We don't like it this way. Oh, yeah. Yeah, you do. Or you would have fixed it by now. Or you would have taken steps to fix it by now. I need to figure out whether or not I really want things to change. Some people revel in all the drama that goes on in families and various situations. In Matthew chapter 5, starting with verse 23. So if you're offering your gift at the altar and there remember your brother has something against you, leave your gift therefore before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you're going with him to court. lest your accuser hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out of jail, or never get out, until you've paid the last penny. Don't keep on going the way you're going. You come to worship, you got somebody that's got something against you, get it worked out. Be willing to be part of the solution. One we've already talked about in Galatians chapter 6, verses 4 and 5, and James chapter 1, verses 13 through 15. Don't play dodgeball. Accept the responsibility and don't shift the blame. I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, we talked about Galatians chapter 6. We talked about the two kinds of burdens, where in one verse it says you're supposed to help a brother bear his burden, and another verse it says you're supposed to bear your own burden. And what's that all about? Well, it's two different kinds of burdens. The one that is talked about in verses 4 and 5 is where every man bears his own burden. It has to do with the cargo of a ship. And that means that ship is built to manage this much weight. And so God has given me the responsibility of accepting responsibility and making things right on my own. And then one that we've talked about in the barriers to communication, don't keep bringing up the past. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, that love chapter, isn't that in there? Isn't that in there where you don't bring up the past? You don't keep a record of wrongs? Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8. All those positive things, and Paul says by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, think on these things. Think about the positive things in your family, in the church, in your community. Think about the positive things about your wife, your husband, your kids, your parents, the elders, the members, the deacons, whoever they are. And even in the direction our country seems to be going sometimes, we might want to count our blessings about where we live, what nation we're citizens of, and count our blessings about that. There are some other things that I want to talk about. I guess we'll stop there and pick it up next week. But maybe some of these things will help. Remember, there's always going to be a challenge as you communicate with one another. And we're trying to help see some things from the Bible that will help me to communicate better and help all of us to communicate better. Thank you very much for your attention.